Evan Mercer had always believed silence was a kind of armor, thin, fragile, but enough to hold back whatever threatened to overwhelm him. Yet as he stood in the dim hallway of his family home, listening to Caleb Rourke's footsteps approaching, he realized his armor was beginning to crack. Moving back into the house had been a temporary decision, a financial detour after a job collapse, but the emotional weight of this place had arrived instantly, clinging to him like humidity in late summer. Caleb appeared at the far end of the hall, crisp shirt sleeves rolled above his elbows, expression set in its usual mixture of confidence and impatience. At 48, Caleb carried himself with the deliberate sharpness of someone who needed the world to recognize him. His presence was neither aggressive nor comforting, only dense, as if every room shifted beneath his mood. "You're up early," Caleb said, voice smooth but edged. "Planning something for the day?" Evan kept his shoulders relaxed. "Just heading out for coffee." "With who?" The question landed with the familiar weight of scrutiny. Caleb had a way of asking ordinary things as if they were cross-examination. "Nobody," Evan replied. "Just coffee." Caleb nodded slowly, unsatisfied but unwilling to push further, for now. He moved past Evan, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne and the pressure of unspoken expectations. The exchange lasted seconds, but it ignited the tension that had been simmering since Evan returned home. Caleb's need to supervise, to guide, to shape, to correct. Evan stepped outside into the cool morning air and exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath since their conversation began. He walked the 4 blocks to Harbor Lane, where a small corner cafe sat tucked between a bookstore and a tailor's shop. He had discovered it by accident his first week back, and it quickly became his temporary sanctuary. Inside, soft jazz spilled from ceiling speakers, and the aroma of roasted beans cut through his restlessness. He ordered his usual and sat by the window, watching early commuters drift past. It was there, mid-sip, that he first noticed the man sketching at the next table, tall, quietly absorbed in his work, with messy auburn hair and hands stained faintly with charcoal. Mason Hale radiated a calm that contrasted sharply with Caleb's constant vigilance. Evan tried not to stare, but curiosity tugged at him. He wasn't used to noticing people so quickly. Mason glanced up, caught Evan looking, and smiled, an unguarded, warm smile that felt completely different from the measured ones Evan had grown accustomed to at home. "Good morning," Mason said. His voice carried a softness, like he'd learned to measure his words carefully, not out of fear but out of consideration. Evan returned the smile. "Morning. What are you working on?" Mason angled his sketchbook just enough for Evan to see, a loosely drawn portrait of an older couple laughing on a park bench. Evan admired the movement in the lines, the way Mason captured emotion rather than detail. "That's impressive," Evan said, "just a warm-up." "Helps my brain wake up," Mason replied. "Are you from around here?" "Kind of." Evan hesitated, choosing his words. "I grew up here. Moved away. Now I'm back for a while." Mason nodded, sensing the heaviness Evan didn't articulate. "Well, if you ever need company here, I'm usually around." The conversation drifted from art to music to trivial morning observations, each exchange smoothing the edge of the day. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, but by the time Evan left, he realized the emptiness he'd carried had shifted, just slightly, but noticeably. When he returned home, the house felt heavier than before. It wasn't the walls or the narrow hallways, it was the awareness that he'd felt lighter elsewhere. And deeply, stubbornly, Caleb sensed it too. Caleb looked up from the dining table as Evan stepped inside. "You were gone longer than usual." A statement, not a question. "I took a walk after coffee," Evan answered, keeping his tone neutral. "With someone?" Caleb pressed. Evan swallowed, irritation flickering under his restraint. "Caleb. I really need you to stop monitoring everything I do." It was the first time he said it directly. The air in the room tightened, as if the walls leaned in to listen. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Monitoring? That's dramatic. I'm trying to help you rebuild your life. I care. Someone has to." The emphasis was too sharp, too pointed. Evan felt the old frustration rise, but he kept himself grounded. "I appreciate concern. I don't appreciate control." Caleb stood slowly, pushing his chair back with deliberate calm. Your mother worries. I check in so she doesn't have to. Evan remained silent. They both knew Linda rarely involved herself in these tensions. She avoided conflict with a kind of practiced grace that left Evan mostly alone in the middle. Caleb exhaled, a controlled breath. If you're seeing someone new, if that's what this is, just be careful. People aren't always what they seem. Evan blinked, taken aback. I just got coffee, that's all. Caleb didn't respond. His gaze was sharp, calculating, as though he were trying to read the parts of Evan he didn't have access to. Then he walked away without another word, but his silence carried more suspicion than any accusation could. The rest of the day moved slowly. Evan tried to focus on job applications, but his mind drifted repeatedly, first to Mason's sketch, then to Caleb's probing gaze. The contrast between them unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully name. That evening, as Evan stepped into his room to finally retreat into quiet, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Hey, it's Mason, from the cafe. If you're around tomorrow, I'd like to show you something I think you'll appreciate. No pressure. A small smile tugged at Evan's lips. The message felt gentle, unassuming, something refreshing in a house filled with tension that he typed back a simple sure. What time? Before he could settle into bed, a shadow crossed his doorway. Caleb stood there, expression unreadable. You're going out tomorrow? He asked. Evan froze. Caleb, please. I just want privacy. Caleb didn't budge. I'm not stopping you. I just think you should be careful about who you trust. There it was again, that same note of implication, as if Caleb sensed too much yet understood too little. Evan drew a breath and met his gaze calmly. I'll be fine. And he would be. At least, he hoped so. As the door closed, Evan felt something shift, subtle but significant. For the first time since returning home, he sensed the possibility of a life beyond these suffocating walls. But he also sensed something else. Caleb wasn't done asking questions, and the road ahead was about to twist in ways he hadn't imagined. The room went quiet, but suspense settled deeper, as if the story he hadn't meant to start was already unfolding without permission. Evan Mercer had spent the morning sifting through job postings, but his thoughts kept wandering back to Mason Hale. The memory of Mason's smile, unassuming yet warm, lingered like a melody he couldn't quite forget. By midday, the restlessness in his chest had become insistent, nudging him toward Harbor Lane. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more, but even as he walked, he acknowledged the truth. Mason's presence offered an escape from the constant pressure of home. The cafe smelled of brewed coffee and worn leather, the scent comforting in its simplicity. Mason was there, hunched over his sketchbook, fingers smudged with charcoal, lost in the delicate lines forming on the page. When he noticed Evan, his expression brightened with quiet surprise. You came back, Mason said. Couldn't stay away, Evan replied, a small grin tugging at his lips. They talked, tentatively at first, but the conversation grew easier with each passing minute. Mason shared stories of his art exhibits, little glimpses into his world that seemed removed from the constant scrutiny Evan endured at home. Evan, in turn, opened up about his time away, the jobs that didn't pan out, the moments of quiet loneliness that followed him even in crowded cities. There was an ease in Mason's listening, a patience that contrasted sharply with Caleb's constant need to intervene. Evan realized he hadn't felt this unguarded in months, perhaps years. As the afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, Evan glanced at his phone and saw several missed calls from Caleb. He considered ignoring them, the idea of defending his independence too alluring, but he knew confrontation was inevitable. Returning home, Evan stepped into the familiar tension that awaited him. Caleb was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with an unreadable expression. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between them. You're late, Caleb said, voice measured but carrying an undertone of suspicion. I was out for coffee. Nothing else, Evan replied, keeping his tone calm. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. With someone? Evan exhaled slowly, fighting the irritation rising within him. Caleb. I'm asking you to trust me. I don't owe you the details of every outing. Caleb's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, then sharpened again. I just want what's best for you. Someone should watch out for you while your mother's away at work. The words were familiar, practiced even, but Evan felt a quiet defiance growing within him. I'm capable of making decisions for myself, he said. And I'd appreciate it if you stopped treating me like I'm a child. Caleb paused, his expression unreadable. If you insist. The concession was partial, but Evan allowed himself a small sense of victory. He retreated to his room, closing the door gently, and let himself breathe. Outside, the day was fading into soft orange light, the edges of the city softening in the glow of dusk. Later, Evan's phone buzzed again. Mason had sent a message, "Meet me at the park tonight. I want to show you something." Evan hesitated, knowing Caleb would disapprove if he found out. But he typed back quickly, "I'll be there." The thrill of defiance, small but significant, pulsed through him. The park was quiet, the air crisp with the approaching evening. Mason was waiting by a bench, sketchbook tucked under his arm, looking effortlessly at ease. "You came," Mason said, standing as Evan approached. "I said I would," Evan replied, a faint smile crossing his face. They walked along the winding paths, sharing stories, ideas, and laughter that felt surprisingly natural. Mason pointed out details in the park, the way the light fell across the trees, the patterns of shadows on the pavement. Each observation felt intimate, as if he were inviting Evan to see the world through his eyes. Evan felt a rare lightness in his chest, a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in months. He realized that Mason wasn't just a distraction from Caleb's constant interference, he was becoming a part of the emotional fabric Evan had been missing. Yet even as he felt drawn into the ease of the evening, the reality of his home life lingered at the edges of his mind. Caleb's warnings, the constant monitoring, the unspoken tension with his mother, all of it weighted, a shadow over the fragile sense of freedom Evan was beginning to enjoy. As they reached a quiet clearing, Mason paused, flipping his sketchbook open. Inside were drawings of the park, but also a small series of sketches that seemed to capture Evan himself, not in detail, but in spirit, the way he moved, the expressions that crossed his face, the subtle hesitations of his hands. "It's impressive," Evan said, feeling a warmth he couldn't entirely explain. "I like capturing people," Mason said. "Not the surface, but the way they feel when no one's looking." Evan realized he felt seen, truly seen, in a way that contrasted sharply with Caleb's constant oversight. The awareness settled over him, both exhilarating and terrifying. They lingered in silence, letting the night air carry the tension and the quiet intimacy between them. Evan knew he couldn't stay here forever. He had responsibilities, a household, a stepfather who would notice his absence. Yet in this moment, he allowed himself to be fully present, to feel the gentle connection growing between them. Eventually, the evening came to a close, and Evan stood to leave, heart heavier than expected. "I should go," he said softly. Mason nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Tomorrow?" Evan nodded, a small smile forming. "Tomorrow." Walking home, Evan felt the pull of two worlds, the stifling, scrutinizing atmosphere of his house, and the fragile, burgeoning sense of freedom and connection Mason had offered. Caleb would ask questions, he knew, and perhaps even challenge him further. Yet Evan also understood something crucial: he could no longer allow his life to be entirely defined by fear or obligation. That night, lying awake in his room, Evan reflected on the day. Mason's presence had stirred something in him, a quiet hope mingled with the familiar anxiety. He thought of Caleb's warnings, his probing questions, and the tension simmering beneath every interaction at home, and yet, for the first time in a long while, Evan felt he had a choice. The day had shown him that connections could exist outside the boundaries of control, that trust and companionship were possible, and that stepping forward, despite fear, was necessary. As he drifted toward sleep, his phone buzzed one final time. A message from Mason: "Sleep well. Tomorrow's another chance to see the world differently." Evan smiled, a faint flicker of anticipation lighting his chest. Tomorrow would indeed bring new possibilities, but also new challenges. And somewhere in that balance, he would need to navigate his own courage, and the questions that awaited him at home. The night was quiet, but the tension remained, threading through the air like a promise. Evan's life was beginning to shift, and nothing would be entirely the same again. Evan Mercer had spent the morning in a restless haze, the memory of the previous evening with Mason Hale replaying in his mind. Each word, each glance, lingered longer than it should have, yet he couldn't help but replay it. The warmth Mason offered felt like sunlight breaking through the shadows of his home, the tension that Caleb Rourke constantly imposed, and even the silent distance of his mother, Linda, whose presence had become more subdued in recent weeks. By midday, Evan knew he had to make a choice. The pull between safety and freedom, obligation and desire, was growing too heavy to ignore. He grabbed his jacket and left the house without answering the usual barrage of questions Caleb might have prepared. Each step toward Harbor Lane carried a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had learned that Mason's calm presence could ground him, but leaving the house meant facing the lingering consequences of defiance. Mason was waiting at their usual spot in the park, sketchbook tucked under one arm, a half-smile on his face that Evan found difficult to resist. "You came," Mason said simply. "Of course," Evan replied, letting himself relax into the moment. The tension that Caleb imposed seemed to dissipate with every step he took toward Mason, as though the distance itself carried away the weight he carried inside. They walked along the winding paths, sharing stories, talking about trivial things at first, but inevitably venturing into deeper territory. Mason asked about Evan's childhood, the places he had loved, the ones he had avoided, and the quiet moments in between. Evan answered honestly, surprised at how easily the words spilled. Mason's patience was a balm, allowing him to reveal layers he had long kept hidden. As the conversation deepened, Evan's phone vibrated. A text from Caleb: "Where are you? Who are you with?" Evan stared at the message, a mixture of irritation and anxiety rising in him. He typed a response but paused. "I'm with someone I trust. I'll be home later." He didn't send it. Not yet. The words felt like a surrender, and he wasn't ready to give in. Mason noticed his hesitation. "Everything okay?" Evan shook his head slightly, forcing a small laugh. "Family stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." Mason didn't press further, but his eyes held a question, a gentle insistence that Evan appreciated but wasn't yet ready to answer. They found a quiet clearing in the park, the light filtering through the trees in golden patches. Mason opened his sketchbook, revealing a series of drawings not just of the park but of Evan himself, capturing the subtle expressions, the slight shifts of posture, the quiet hesitations he hadn't realized were so visible. "It's impressive," Evan said, feeling a warmth he couldn't fully describe. Mason shrugged modestly. "I try to see the person behind the face. People carry stories in their expressions. I just try to catch them." Evan felt an unfamiliar weight lift from his chest. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt truly seen, recognized not for what he did or what he was supposed to be, but simply for who he was. The sense of relief mingled with fear. Freedom always carried a price when it clashed with Caleb's constant presence at home. As they walked back toward the streetlights that marked the park's edge, Mason paused. "You have a choice, Evan. Every day. You can stay under someone else's control, or you can step out and make your own decisions. It's scary, but necessary." Evan nodded slowly. Mason's words resonated more deeply than any lecture from Caleb ever could. Caleb's concern had always come dressed as guidance, but Mason's perspective was raw, authentic, and grounded in trust, not obligation. Later that evening, back at home, Evan faced the inevitable confrontation. Caleb was in the living room, waiting as if he had been expecting Evan's return at the precise moment he stepped through the door. The air was taut, heavy with the quiet tension that had become their unspoken norm. "You were gone longer than I expected," Caleb said, tone neutral but sharp at the edges. "I needed some time," Evan replied evenly. "Time to think, to clear my head." Caleb's gaze sharpened. "Time with someone?" Evan drew a deep breath. "Yes. With Mason. I need to make my own choices, Caleb. I need to live my life without constant oversight." Caleb's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise, frustration, and something softer, almost regret. "I just want to protect you. That's all. I don't want you to get hurt." "I know," Evan said, his voice firm but not harsh. "And I appreciate it." But controlling me doesn't protect me, it confines me. I need boundaries, Caleb. For both our sakes. Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sank into the armchair, his shoulders heavy, his hands clasped loosely. "You're right," he said quietly. I didn't realize how much I was overstepping." Evan felt a mixture of relief and caution. Caleb's words were a step forward, but trust had to be rebuilt slowly, and the past weeks of tension didn't disappear overnight. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot." Later that night, Evan lay in his room, thinking about the day, the conversations with Mason, and the confrontation with Caleb. The sense of choice lingered in his mind, the realization that he could navigate his own path, even within the confines of the household. Even while under scrutiny. His phone buzzed gently, a message from Mason: "Hope you're okay. Remember, freedom isn't always loud, it's quiet, steady, and yours if you claim it." Evan smiled faintly, feeling the calm reassurance Mason always seemed to bring that eye and the quiet of his room. Evan reflected on what he had learned, that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it, that trust could exist outside of control, and that boundaries, once set, could protect and liberate simultaneously. He realized that his journey wasn't about defying Caleb for the sake of rebellion, nor was it about escaping his family. It was about claiming space, emotional, mental, and personal, for himself, and for the connections that nurtured rather than restricted him. And yet, even in this moment of clarity, a small part of him recognized that the days ahead would bring new challenges. Caleb's presence remained a constant, Mason's quiet guidance a delicate thread, and the shifting dynamics of trust and freedom were far from resolved. As the night deepened and the city outside his window settled into silence, Evan closed his eyes with a sense of cautious hope. Tomorrow would bring decisions, revelations, and perhaps even surprises. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face them, not as a passive observer in his own life, but as the one shaping the story as it unfolded. The house was quiet, the tension had eased for now, but Evan knew this was only the beginning. Life had shifted, subtly yet irrevocably, and the next chapter was waiting to be written.